For this next panel, we're going to take a deep dive into domestic and foreign policies in each country. Session 2, U.S.-China competition, a tale of two countries. This panel is being broadcast and live streamed to our members in Seattle, where we launched a new center in September. For those joining virtually, you need to be in the room to ask questions, so join us in person next time. After this session, for the virtual participants, we do have a special Zoom meeting. You should have all received a Zoom link right before this session. You're going to have a chance to do a post-discussion with our speaker, Ryan Haas. So check your emails. Session 2, after this, we're going to have a short break. Please join me in welcoming Ryan Haas, Keith Jai, and moderator Jim McGregor.
Well, I've got an easy task today because of the two people I have with me. I'll just give a quick introduction. Keith Jai, I first met Keith Jai when I was in Beijing, and everybody said to me, have you seen the latest Keith Jai story? He really was the guy that was breaking a lot of stories and what was going on in Chinese politics, Chinese leadership for the Wall Street Journal. He's written for Reuters, a number of people that know. Now you're working with Peter Mandelson's group, is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ryan Haas needs no introduction. He's head of the Brookings China Center at Brookings, was head of China, Mongolia, and Taiwan during Biden administration. What was his name? the Obama administration. So today I want to go back to APEC because Margaret had so much fun there. She wanted to hear about it again. The description of APEC with from David Ignatius, it was two boxers in a clinch, just holding on to each other, trying not to punch each other. But if you look what happened, it was military to military, the fentanyl precursors, looking at AI risks. Apparently there's 12 working groups set up. I don't know how many of them are working, but there's 12 groups, I'm told. And you contrast that back with 2021 in Alaska, when we had what was almost the diplomatic equivalent of the Jerry Springer show, where you had everybody just excoriating each other. Yang Jiechi went on for 16 minutes, and the U.S. side was not that much more polite. That was the beginning of this relationship. So if you look back at that and you look at APEC, it was quite a bit of improvement, even though it's a low bar these days on just having people talk. Of course, we had Bali, which was the spirit of Bali, which was punctured by a balloon. And then we come to APEC, and now things are, China's on a charm offensive. And the U.S. is, the U.S. has been trying to talk to China for a long time, and China would just say, we will talk to you after you admit everything that is wrong in the relationship is your fault. And that didn't bring a lot of discussions for quite a while. So after APEC, I looked at, I listened to some interviews that came out later just to see what the reaction was. And I'm just going to pull out a couple quotes here. Kurt Campbell is going to be the deputy secretary. He just talked about careful, purposeful diplomacy with China, identify where we can work together. But he did say we want to make clear we're not going to go anywhere. We're an Asian power, we're an Indo-Pacific power, and we're going to continue to behave as such. Then there's Congressman Gallagher from the Select Committee. His view was that Biden's whole engagement strategy is a bad move for no other reason that such engagement has failed for 2 decades. He did want to say that I believe is that we're in the early stages of a new Cold War with the Chinese Communist Party. And Congressman Gallagher, if you talk to him behind closed doors, he's quite reasonable, but this is performative politics. You get out in front of a microphone and you say pretty strong things. But he is the loudest voice in the room in Washington. They don't have legislative power, they got subpoena power, but they are the loudest voice in the room and set a lot of the tone of the discussion. Secretary Raimondo at the Reagan National Defense Forum was very strong. She shocked some of the people with her remarks there, and it was with a group of security people, so you can understand. But she said the world needs us to manage our relationship with China responsibly to avoid escalation. We've got to do all that, but make no mistake about it, China's not our friend, and we need to be eyes wide open about the extent of the threat. She also went after the chip companies and says, I don't want to see you designing your chips to come in just under my threshold. You may lose a little bit of money when I put out these things, but it's good for the country, and you should, we need to move ahead together. That's stronger than she usually talks, but again, it was a security group. And China China was just completely positive on the outcomes. And now, of course, we've had Liu Jianchao in Washington and New York talking about the San Francisco vision, trying to be very positive in whatever he says. Even Xi Jinping, I think last week, sent a letter to this lady he met 40 years ago in Iowa, talking about people to people, and so that's positive. Another analysis, I'll just do a couple more quotes and then we'll move on here. But Ian Bremmer, who's very good at packaging ideas, after APEC, he said, the Chinese are uncertain of the future of the U.S. political system. The U.S. is uncertain of the future of the Chinese economic system. Huang Yasheng from MIT, who's always worth listening to, he said, essentially, these two countries kind of got married without knowing each other's religions. So I guess where I look at where we are right now is China's on a charm offensive and we're kind of on a harm defensive. We're structuring ourselves to block ourselves from the harm we're feeling from China on technology, et cetera. So with that, just kind of trying to provoke a few things, I'll turn it to my colleagues for some opening remarks and then we'll get a discussion going. Keith.
Hey, thank you very much, Jim. I think given all these contacts between China and the U.S. these days, maybe I'll just start to focus more about domestically in China, and then we can move on to Ryan. And I think these days, when people talk about Chinese politics or Chinese policies, the easier way to look at it, I think from my end, is more looking at towards how Xi Jinping's leadership, how he himself managed China domestically. And over the past few years, there are always been the case that, when people talk about Xi's leadership, whether it's wishful thinking, whether it's about underestimate the power of Xi, there are several rounds about okay, this guy's losing his power, this guy is not in full control of the Communist Party. Even with the latest round of the anti-corruption purge in the military, in the foreign affairs sector, there have always been the noise and saying, okay, this guy is not in control. But in my personal view, I kind of feel this is not necessarily the case because, if we think about Chinese history, in what kind of cases that, when I purged or when I basically removed all these senior officials, and I'm still sitting in this position. So I think the last time around, maybe during the time of Mao, and if earlier, it will be sometime around the Qing dynasty, maybe, when the emperor, they can easily remove anybody in the room and still not or barely get affected. So I think from that regard, I always believe if we look at from the power perspective, Xi is definitely in the absolute control. And as we always discuss over the past 10 years, that he's he's actually the most powerful leader after Mao. But still, if we look at China today and Mao's time, I think there are some major challenges towards Xi, and also because there are so many major changing factors over the past 70 plus years. And the first thing I think is it would be how the leaders build up their reputation and get to manage their officials. If you look at the time of Mao, I think Mao definitely built up his reputation among all the Chinese officials, no matter how senior or how junior these people are, from the time of warfares. So during the time ever started from China, Japan, KMT, CPC, all these battles actually brought Mao to a different stage that majority of the Chinese officials back in the days, they respected him. So in a way that, he has a very much like authority built up through the years, through all kinds of victories that he led this party towards. So you can, I think one analogy I always want to make is compare the management style of Communist Party with any other MNCs. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, there are lots of similarities. And for the party, I mean, the management style is very, it's as important as any management style in any other MNCs. And the way that she manages this company or this party right now is sort of managing with fear in lots of cases. That's why ever since we see from 2013, he just took the presidency. I mean every year there's some ongoing major anti-corruption campaigns. And even and I think I can't remember when he actually started. But I mean the state broadcaster every year in the very beginning, they're gonna have a series of TV shows, bring some senior officials to confess on TV. And that became actually a tradition. And in a way, it's very similar to Chinese New Year Gala. Every year, at the very beginning of the year, you're gonna see a bunch of Chinese officials to come up to the stage and make confession on TV. So I mean, I think this kind of management style, I mean, as many of us can feel in different organizations and companies, driven by fear is probably the worst management style you can ever get. And that's because you don't really get any responses or feedbacks anymore, because people managed under you, they can't really say anything otherwise. And so I think this is one of the biggest difference between I mean not biggest difference, the biggest challenge for Xi right now. And the other part would be the difficulty for him would be managing the expectations. I mean I know we have a separate conversation about economy and investment in China these days. But if you look at China's economic and financial real estate policies, everything over the past year, to be honest, they had changed and rolled out lots of new policies in order trying to boost the confidence from the private sectors and the market. And including Jim, as you were saying, some of these goodwill signals, messages they're trying to send to global investors, global communities. It's pretty much they're trying to they're trying to change some of these losing confidence from domestically in China as well as global investors. But it failed. And it's not really working towards the way they wanted. And if you think about why, I think largely it's because they failed to manage the expectations. And if you think about China over the past years, or the Communist Party since 1949, I think largely they never bothered to manage expectations. Not only just from domestically in China, but more importantly, global investors. Because for the most part of the first 30 or 40 years, the party didn't bother to manage, global investors' expectation because there's no global investors. And they didn't have to work with anyone. And for domestically, it's the same. I mean, everybody pretty much at the time, they lived under the poverty line. And any slightly change towards that, people will feel much better. And then we had this opening up and reform. And what after that is that it's a manage that didn't need the party or the leadership to manage expectations. And why is because as long as everybody can make money from this market. And that's the best expectation management already. So like everybody come to this market, not necessarily like international investors or domestic public. They can feel, okay, today is better, it's good, tomorrow will be better, and the day after tomorrow will be even better. So that's pretty much the best expectation management you can ever get. So for a very long period of time since China is opening up the reform, they didn't really have to think about, okay, for example, like in the case of Fed and all these financial institutions like in the global markets, they have to keep delivering or communicate with players like in the markets. And that's also because management of the expectation is so important. But in the case of China, because the market is so good, they didn't have to bother. And that's why we see whatever happened to Chinese tech companies like Didi and Meituan, all these investigations, really including the recent announcement towards gaming industry in China. All these things there's no single communication before or afterwards from the authorities, And which this unpredictable, scenario really triggered lots of people losing confidence, maybe for good towards this market.
We'll get into confidence and trust a little later, I think, because I think that's a really good subject to dig into. Ryan, why don't you?
Yeah.
Well, thank you. It's really wonderful to be on a stage with the two of you. Keith has looked at the China side of the equation. I will try to look at the American side of the equation. More specifically, I will try to offer a perspective on how I expect politics is going to impact policy towards China in the year ahead. Because as we all know, we're in a political year, a presidential and legislative election year in the United States. And I sort of start this with three assumptions. The first is that for President Biden, his topmost priority is to win re-election. For him and his team, they view this election as an existential choice where the future of democracy in the United States hangs in the balance. So everything is subordinate to winning, winning, winning. My second assumption is that President Trump will be the Republican nominee. And my third assumption is that that policy on China will continue to be driven out of the White House. So if you accept those three assumptions, where does that take us? I think where it takes us is that there will be a pretty notable sort of signal to noise ratio on China in the United States in the year ahead. In other words, we're going to hear a ton about China over the next 12 months, but I'm not sure that it's going to have that much of an impact on overall policy towards China. And here's why. For President Trump, he wants to talk about China. He wants all of us to talk about China. He wants us to think every day about China, and he wants us to think of it in terms of strong and weak. That President Biden has been weak in defending the United States against Chinese predations and that he would be strong. And he wants to point to the trade deficit. He wants to point to Chinese people taking American workers' jobs. He wants to talk about influx of immigrants. All these things are intended to support the broader narrative that America needs a strong leader to push back against the Chinese and others who wish to do ill to America's future. President Biden doesn't want to talk about China every day. He wants the front page of the newspaper to be Donald Trump's face every day. Because for President Biden, he wants this election to be an election about President Trump's unfitness to serve as president. And every day that we are debating the finer points of China policy is a day where we're not focusing on the significant harm or risk that President Trump would bring to the White House if he were to be reelected. And so for them, for the Biden team, strong and weak is not the frame that they want to use to talk about China. It's competence versus chaos. That the Biden team wants to argue that they represent competence. As Liz and Danny, you heard from them, there's a methodical, thoughtful strategy that is being implemented step by step to put the United States in a stronger position to compete with China over the long term. That's what they want to describe as competence. Whereas the other guys, President Trump and his team, would be impulsive, irrational, erratic, emotional, in ways that could bring us to the precipice of crisis and potentially conflict with China. And if there's one thing that everyone in America agrees upon as it relates to China is that we really would not like to have a war with them. And so that is the space that the Biden administration would like to take the discussion around China. The second point that they will make as a defensive point if they're under attack about China is that, look, all of President Trump's tariffs, we kept them. Not only did we keep all these tariffs, we built upon them with additional export controls, with additional outbound investment screening. So what is it that you guys are balking about? We have gone further than the Trump administration was able to in a more cohesive government-wide effort to try to limit challenges posed by China. And so this is, I think, the broad terms of the debate that we will have as it relates to China in the coming year. But the big point that I want to leave you with and welcome your reactions to is that even though we're going to have this debate, it's not going to lead to a significant fluctuation in the direction of our overall policy. Because if you are President Biden and you care foremost about winning re-election, you don't want to take a softer approach towards China. You don't necessarily want to take a sharper approach to China either, because if the relationship escalates and becomes, uncontrollably hostile, that is bad as well. It erodes the competence versus chaos framing. You want sort of a steady, tough, measured, firm, predictable way of dealing with China so that the focus can remain on what they want to talk about, which is President Trump's unfitness to serve. So for all of us who are clamoring for a fine debate about the benefits of de-risking versus decoupling or strategic ambiguity versus strategic clarity, we're going to have to wait a year because that's not what this year is about. This year is going to be a year where the politics are loud and the policy is pretty steady.
Well, I'm going to get back to trust and confidence because I want to, both you guys can weigh in on, has there ever been trust between China and the U.S. since rapprochement? Has there ever been real trust? Is there, people talk about we need to build trust in order to make it work. They talk about working together on cancer, climate change, whatever. In the political atmosphere of both countries, because China right now is very focused on you can, economically in China, you could do fixed asset investment, you could do infrastructure, you could do exports, and the economy would roll along. But now that you're trying to build a domestic economy, that means you have to have the trust of the people. They have to think they're going to have a better life, they're going to move ahead. So China's got its own problem domestically on trust. Is it possible to have trust between these two? Is there a way to have trust building measures?
You go ahead first.
Well, sure, I'll start. I don't think that there has ever been deep wells of trust in the U.S.-China relationship. I think that as far as I can look back and speak with people who were there in 1972 and 1979, I don't think anyone was ever under any illusion that they were dealing with anything other than committed communists who had their own interests and objectives that were at odds in important areas with American interests and objectives. That said, there have been periods where there's been more high-functioning relationships and periods where there have been less high-functioning relationships. And if you look back, the one commonality of every issue that has been managed effectively, every problem that has been solved in the U.S.-China relationship for the past 45 years, is that they have all been managed or solved by people who have built relationships with each other. Not relationships of trust, but relationships that allow both sides to understand the other's constraints and goals, what they most need to avoid and what they most need to achieve, what their personal background is, where their ambitions are taking them. And even in the Trump administration, the one agreement that they reached was between Robert Lighthizer and Liu He after they had spent considerable time together over a period of years. In the Biden administration, the one relationship, the one channel that functions most effectively is between Jake Sullivan and Wang Yi. What have they done? They have spent considerable time together meeting in random places like Luxembourg and Malta and elsewhere, where they have spent days together talking and getting to know each other, their background, their history, their direction, their ambition. And so I wouldn't categorize it as trust, but I do think that there is a value in high-functioning relationship.
And I agree with Ryan. And just quickly to add, I think, the strong, deep trust has never been there. But back in the days, I think there was a very strong goodwill toward U.S., from China's side. And I think that goodwill has sort of lost these days. And one biggest reason is also because, I think gets back to a point as well, Jim. I mean, for the U.S. side to reinstall some sort of some degree of trust between China and the U.S. it's also because they also need the Chinese people domestically. They have the trust towards the government, towards the party, again, in order for people outside of China to reinstall some of their trust. And if domestic people, they don't really have that towards the government these days, I mean, how possible people outside of China could install their trust? And in lots of cases, let's say some of the elite Chinese and senior people, when they travel outside of China and talking to Americans, Europeans, and people from elsewhere, I mean, in many cases, they are the ones who started to doomsayers, talking about relationship in a much bearish way compared to outsiders. I think it's even harder for outsiders to reinstall that kind of trust. I mean, I only been here for a few months, but over the past few months, as I mentioned to Ryan, I mean, I met probably more Chinese investors in the Bay Area than on the streets of Beijing's Haidian district. So I think that speaks something.
Let me add a little to this. I was just in China for a month. I hadn't been there in a few years since COVID. And what really struck me was people I talked to, both people senior and just the Lao Baixing, a word I hadn't heard much before or almost at all before in describing the government is people talked about the government's incompetence. In the past, they didn't like the direction, they didn't like certain policies, but you didn't hear them talking about incompetence because they were seeing the bullet trains, they were seeing their cities being redone, they were seeing their lives getting better. But one after another, people are talking about the government being incompetent. There's a PTSD from the way COVID was handled. There's a look at all the policies where they've hurt themselves, whether it's the way they cracked down on the entrepreneurs and scared them out of the country, or the real estate. Let's have 3 red lines, but let's put them out there before we figure out what they're going to do. Stuff like that. I mean, what about trust in Xi Jinping's leadership in the party?
I think
they got fear. Do they have trust that he's going to take it in the right direction?
That's a very good question. I think it's quite nuanced as well. I mean, I think one of the great things the party has ever done over the past years is that I think in a certain way lots of people became middle class. Middle class means they have houses, they have their assets, properties, whatever in China. So in a way, their future and their destiny, has together bundled together with the interests of the party and the government. So in a way that it's not necessarily whether they trust or not. It's more that have to trust. So if you don't trust, what you can do. So I think especially over the past few months, I think everybody knows the problem is out there, all the problems are deep. But I think it's more of many people they still have this good wishful thinking, or they have the thinking and say, okay, things will be better, things will change, and I think that's definitely out there. But whether we can say, oh, these people definitely trust the direction of where they're heading. No, I think especially over the past 30 years, most of the Chinese officials in this generation, right? I mean they also the fruits, they also saw the success of the globalization, how China interact with the rest of the world. And the change in direction, I think definitely it's a shock to all of them. Yeah. Well,
we were talking before the panel on the phone, and one thing that you said that struck me was, other leaders of China in this buildup, the economy was pretty much rocking and rolling and people's lives were getting better. Xi has now taken over, and he's taken over a very successful company. Lots of problems, but a lot of growth. And under his regime, it's taken a wrong turn. What kind of pressure does that put on him? Because he's jumping on top of a success. He's not building on a failure.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think like I mean, I can't speak his mind, but like I do think like, like there's one internal speech he made when he first like installed as the party chief. It's quite telling. I mean, like, so basically, I think back in the days, there's in 2013, like there's a local newspaper, like, like accidentally leaked like an internal speech from Xi, and which he said, like basically, I think the whole idea is like, I'm taking all these responsibilities, I'm taking like this new course, and if it doesn't work, then like I'm the first one gonna get doomed. So that's pretty much like the first message. Like I think he has this awareness that like everything is now like on his shoulder. And coming back to like slightly to the China-U.S. relationship as well. I mean, like I think for him, like he definitely understands, like a warfare between like China and Taiwan, like or a larger China and the U.S. will definitely put way more pressure on his shoulders. And for that reason, I think, like anything he's doing right now is purely based on like this calculation or recalculation as he himself also seeing like, like things getting much more dangerous towards that direction.
Ryan, weigh in on whatever you want here.
Well, I was just listening to Keith and thinking about it, and if I was Xi Jinping and I was facing all these challenges, it would be nice to have an external problem to divert attention to. And the more loud and sort of symbolic we are in our performative outrage about Chinese behavior in ways that are perceived as intending to undercut or humiliate him, the easier it is, I think, for him to say, we, China, need a strong leader, because if we don't have a strong leader that keeps everything together and pushing forward, we will come under unrelenting pressure from those rapacious Americans who want to do us harm. And so to a certain extent, I think a measured, steady, methodical, tough-minded approach is the most stressful scenario that Xi Jinping could confront. Sort of a loud arm-waving, finger-waving approach makes it a little easier for him to deal with some of the stress.
He's been in his first couple terms, at least parts of it, he's been unrelenting in his criticism of the U.S. and really painting a dark portrait. And now he's on a charm offensive, even sending a letter to Iowa. Is that because he all of a sudden loves the U.S.? Here's a question. Is it because of the economy going south and he needs the foreigners? Or is it also because he's under pressure under the party? I mean, this guy may be the strongest fragile leader in the world.
I personally, I think there's there's a misjudgment from, I don't know whether himself or like from the leadership. And that is like, for a very, very long time, if we look at like, I remember Liz was saying like, that we can read a bunch of like government releases and statements like from Xi. I mean, like one thing is in common, especially in the first 10 years, is that he has keep saying that, China is the largest factory like in the world, no one can, live from Chinese market. And I think like it was right for like a large part of the past like decades. And also it was right, even like after like Trump's like trade war towards China, back in the days there were lots of concerns and worries towards, okay, should we like decouple from China's like supply chain, this and that. But even back in the days it was really tough. And so like this give him like the confidence just to be like, okay, no one gonna leave from Chinese market. But I think that is changing. And that change today, I mean, I think it only started after like March, maybe like last year. So this like recent change has definitely like changed the way, himself and also like other leaders in China to look at this issue. I mean, like issue as in like China, U.S., China's relationship with other countries. That's why we see that this is a change of like, wolf warrior diplomacies and stuff like that. So I think like that is like, I mean, I think to me, I think that's a biggest change like towards this relationship. So.
Ryan, let's move this competition to a higher level and look at the world. When Mr. Xi came into office, China and the U.S. were partners. I mean, troubled, but there was a partnership going on with the West, actually. Today, we got Russia, North Korea, Syria, you name it. China's, we're talking about a competition. We've now got a competition going for the global South, and China's really aligned itself up with a whole, very clearly, with an anti-Western coalition.
Right. Well, Jim, I think there's a question in there, and I'll try to extrapolate it, which is that what I see is China's behavior right now is true to form. If you look back at the sweep of history, when China encounters problems at home, they try to calm the waters abroad in order to concentrate resources and focus on the problems at home. I think that we're seeing that now, just like we saw it in 2015, and we've seen it in previous iterations as well. And so I think this is tactical. I don't think that his heart has warmed to the Americans after his wonderful time in San Francisco. I think it's a very tactical pause to try to regroup, reorient, and refocus on the challenges closer to home. Now, to your broader question, I agree that the United States and China, one of the notable features of the relationship today is its absence of shared purpose. There have been sort of consistent issues that have transcended across the entire relationship where we just have fundamental philosophical disagreements. They're the same today as they were in 1972, although some of the features are different. But we had sort of a zero-sum view of Taiwan in 1972. We have similar zero-sum nature view of it today. We had philosophical disagreements about human rights in 1972. We have philosophical disagreements about human rights today. What is different today relative to other periods in the relationship is that there is no shared purpose to the relationship that provides any buffering to those sharp, hard edges that have been continuous in the relationship. And this is sort of a new feature. I think that a lot of that shared purpose wore off during the Trump era, and it has yet to be rebuilt. I don't think it's going to be rebuilt this coming year, 2024. We'll have to see after we get beyond 2024 if the two countries again are able to find the capacity to act in mutual self-interest in ways that serve their own purposes on issues where we both will be either harmed or helped depending upon how the issue is dealt with. Because there are zero-sum issues to the relationship, but there are a lot of issues that are either positive or negative-sum. In other words, we're both going to be affected one way or the other depending upon...
Well, can shared responsibilities replace shared purpose? There's a lot of things we have to cooperate on in the world for the good of the world and the good of our own countries.
Sure. Why not? Why not?
Give it a try, huh?
Yeah.
Let's turn to the audience for questions. There's microphones around somewhere, I think. Just raise your hand and Mark Cohen. You got to use a microphone because I think it's all being recorded. And tell people who you are, except everybody already knows you.
Yeah, well, that's very kind, Jim. Thank you very much. Great panel. I had a question for Ryan, or perhaps an observation. I don't know if I share your sense about Biden avoiding China in order to focus on this competency issue, because the China issue doesn't really play out so well for President Biden. And the reason I say that, as you said it, the trade policies he's continuing. The tariffs he's continuing. He was the vice president in the Obama period, and Trump made a point of disavowing so many of the Obama period policies. So he can say he found religion, but the religion is very Trumpist. So I don't see how that really plays out. I think it's an issue maybe for him to avoid and to focus on domestic issues, but I don't think it's an issue that he can really engage in that effectively, because he comes out, for people who have at least 5 years or so sense of history, not looking that great. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, Mark, I don't think that we had any sharp disagreements there. I was trying to suggest that President Biden isn't really interested in having a detailed debate about China policy in 2024, and I think that's what you're saying.
This is a pretty shy group. We got anybody with their hands up? There we go.
Hi, good morning. My name is Julian Ventura. I'm a former Mexican ambassador to Beijing, now with the Albright Stonebridge Group and Chatham House in London. I agree with the assessment in terms of what the dynamics will be in an election year in China. I wonder what your thoughts are on potentially some issues cropping up, like fentanyl, because of its domestic political implication, beyond the Biden and Xi meetings in San Francisco, there was a triangle with the Mexican president's meetings with Biden and with Xi Jinping on the same issue in terms of getting some cooperation to address fentanyl flows to the U.S. And number two, what should the business community be doing in terms of scenario planning vis-a-vis electoral outcomes? Just bet on basically this strand of continuity between Trump 1.0 and Biden. There's a lot of talk about this 10% universal tariff that the Trump people are talking about. Would that apply to USMCA in North America, which is seen by Trump as his baby? What should they be looking for in terms of the dynamics, in terms of electoral outcomes and toward 2025? Thank you.
Maybe I can start from the second question, actually.
Sure.
Yeah.
Would that be okay, Jay?
Yep.
I mean, I think, definitely, one thing I'm really, I was trying to add to, Ryan as well, actually, on the potential, risk, as you were mentioning, is that, I mean, the more, pressure, on Xi's shoulders, as in, domestic, economy is, getting towards, even, worse stage, I think the likelihood, for the administration, for Chinese government, to find an external enemy. I mean, that's normally, in normal case, that's how you're trying to, diversify the pressure on yourself and try by having something external. So over the years, we had Japan, we had Taiwan has always been an easy target. But given the election year, in the U.S., it's also hard to predict, we don't even know, who will be the next, president in the U.S. or the administration is, but still, I think there are lots of potential, for black swan possibilities. And especially between, in Taiwan, there's a new administration as well. In the U.S., we'll have a new one as well in any case. The likelihood, the possibility for black swan in most of cases, in my knowledge, is because of the communication or the information it's not moving from one place to the other correctly. And in this particular scenario, I think the likelihood is definitely increased. So but still, I think policies would largely, unless there are black swan events, I think policies would remain largely the same from China. I guess as Ryan was saying, also from the U.S. perspective as well. And so I don't know, for example, if this company has been trying to diversify their supply chain from China over the past year, maybe they should continue to do so. And and for companies still need to allocate some of their investment in China, I think to me, I think because they're a structure of the company or whatever, I would see that still to be need to be continued. But the tendency for black swan events, I think definitely on the rise. Yeah.
I didn't quite understand the first question, but with so many Chinese companies moving manufacturing to Mexico now, with the USMCA and tariff-free, are we going to end up in a lot of political battles with Mexico and China together now over this? Because all of a sudden these Chinese companies are going to be able to have duty-free access to America. And they're moving there from what I'm told, in quite strong numbers.
Well, it's a question I will ask the ambassador at our coffee break, because I think it's a good question. But look, I think it's going to be hard for us if we are okay with German auto manufacturers moving to Mexico, but we have a problem with BYD moving to Mexico. What is the intellectual basis that we'll use to justify why we're treating the two differently? On the first question of fentanyl, I think that it's the top priority for the Biden administration and the U.S.-China relationship right now, because it touches every congressional district and every community in America. I think all of us know someone who's been impacted either directly or indirectly by the fentanyl epidemic. It's the leading cause of death for people 18 to 49. This is huge.
74,000 people in 2022 died from fentanyl.
It's huge, and it's tragic. And there is, I think, a pretty steady drumbeat of engagements that are planned between the United States and China over the coming year. And each of these will concentrate on implementation of the agreement between the two leaders on the fentanyl issue. So if I were Xi Jinping, and I'm not, and I'm never in the business of offering them advice, but I wouldn't want China to be a central issue in the presidential debate in 2024. And I wouldn't want reneging on an agreement between President Xi and President Biden over fentanyl to be a defining feature of that debate. And so I think for their own reasons, irrespective of how they feel about us or about the issue, they have an incentive to do their best to try to manage the flow of precursor chemicals over the year ahead.
We got 10 minutes here. Let's get a couple more questions. All the way in back.
Thank you.
Hi, honorable speakers. My name is Emerson Cui. I'm a geopolitical strategist and I used to intern with the Asia Society and Jimmy Carter Foundation. As we can see from today's competition and world problems are generated from systematic antagonism between open society and authoritarians. People do want good lives, but under authoritarian regimes, their choices and factors are limited by fear of repression. So my only question is, under divisionary strategy of authoritarian leadership, how could private sectors and business companies try to extend the time before the authoritarian leaders choose using force to solve their domestic problem? How do they incentivize the top leadership to collaborate with each other and their counterparts in open society?
One of you guys try it.
I'm not sure if I get the question fully, but are you talking about leaderships in China or leadership in different governments in the world?
How can business communities from the United States incentivize Chinese leadership to collaborate into the open society system and to resolve information asymmetry between the two sides? As we know, China got fireworks to prevent its people from accessing the real information of the open society and free world.
All right, let me tackle that briefly. Having American business in China over the years, I was there for 30 years and very involved with the business community. And I can tell you, we do need bridges between these two countries, and whether it's an education bridge or a diplomatic bridge, the deepest bridge is the business bridge. Millions of people working together, the values of American and European and other corporations being inculcated into the society. It's important. They may not change China, but they bring in a more open viewpoint. And I can tell you, when I was just back there, that's what people are really missing. So many of the foreigners are left, that bridge and the ideas and the way of thinking and talking, etc. People are feeling lonely. So I think the bridge, the business bridge is important, and we have to keep it going. We're not going to solve authoritarianism. That's been around for a while. Next question, please. Right here in the middle.
Thanks. Will Mannon, I'm an entrepreneur. I also study Chinese. So I have a question just about potential future scenarios if we assume that Biden and Trump are the nominees. Would it be possible to share a brief synopsis of actual substantive policy changes that could come in 2025?
That sounds like a question for Ryan Haas.
Yeah.
Well, look, this is a game anyone can play, but I think that it depends upon what mental image of President Trump you have. Is it the 2020, 2021 mental image of being deeply frustrated about COVID and COVID cover-up and the effect that it had upon his view of his ability to be reelected? Or is it 2023 Trump, where the focus is really on immigration and crime and inflation and issues like that are much more internally focused, whereas the outside world is a lesser issue? And if you look at polling, there's a question that Pew asked on an annual basis: should the United States play an active role in the world? The gap between self-identified liberals and conservatives has doubled over the past 3 years. It's gone from 17 to 35%. 65% of liberals think that the United States should play an active role in the world. 30% of conservatives do. And if you assume that President Trump is has a pretty reptilian feel for the views of his base, then that may offer a bit of a sense of the direction of travel that he may take.
Okay. Back in the middle, sir.
My name is Roger Dong. Nobody knows who I am. I'm a troublemaker. I've been a China watcher since 1967 with the Department of Defense. And so I think I bring a little bit of experience. I do not have the educational credentials our colleagues have here. But let's talk about fentanyl. Xi Jinping knew the questions that were posed to him before he came here. He knew about fentanyl, he thought about it, and he decided to say yes. He may not be successful, but he's going to work very hard to make it. People don't understand that for a president of China facing the world to say that I'll take care of this problem, if he doesn't, he really loses face. So if you understand Chinese culture, you will see that he's not bullshitting, and he intends to do something about it. I don't know whether or not it's going to be successful, but just looking at the fentanyl issue, I lecture on APEC, and I cover that. That's one of the features about. You read the Wall Street Journal, all these journalists are saying that Xi Jinping didn't know what he's talking about. He has no chance of doing it, and he's saying it's just a BS. But the thing is, I can almost guarantee you, as a China specialist watching, I know Xi Jinping. The issue with the Iowa farms, in 1985, Xi Jinping was a farm delegation, went to a farm, stayed there for about a month, and when he left there, he loved Americans. He loved America so much that as soon as he got home, he sent his daughter, Xi Jinping, to Harvard to get her degree. Okay, thank you.
Well, the news reports actually during APEC were that they were already closing down or going after some of these precursor companies. So I think you're correct, and they are taking it seriously. Okay, last question. There we go. What table? I can't even see the table number. Stand up, then we know where you're there. Right behind you.
My name is Ganzorg. I have a point. When discussing U.S. and China competition, in my personal belief, no matter who is in charge of the government, China has always preserved the same strategy, same attitude toward how it treats, how it governs its people and neighbors and enemies alike. So speaking from Mongolian perspective, I think it's worth, if not important, to take a look into the history between how China dealt with Mongolians, its invasion, and how they protected itself. So I'd like to hear from Ryan in terms of looking at policies. Do you look back into history and how China has dealt, how it withstood, northern invasion, all that stuff? Thank you.
Well, I very much agree with your point that we must be grounded in history as we think about the future. And that's part of the reason why I've been so troubled by the recent discourse in Washington that China expertise is overrated because the China experts got it all wrong, which is sort of the prevalent view right now. And I'm not here to, argue balls and strikes over past policy, other than to say that if we don't have an awareness of Chinese statecraft, Chinese traditions, Chinese strategy, then we are doing ourselves a tremendous disservice. And I think that I very much agree with you. I think that there is a lot to be learned by the way that China has dealt with Mongolians, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and others to understand and anticipate their future behavior. I also find it interesting that there is such a resurgence of interest in Genghis Khan and that time period of Chinese history inside China today.
I think we're in that. We'll end with that. I'd like to thank my panelists here. We went through a lot of issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much for outlining what we should all be looking forward to in the year ahead. And Jim McGregor for your 6th year in a row at this conference.